A continuación, solicitamos la presencia en el proscenio de la doctora Margarita Irizarry Ramírez. Ella es co-coordinadora del componente 2 del proyecto, quien tendrá a bien presentar a la conferenciante invitada, la doctora Sarah Browner. Adelante, doctora.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias a ustedes por estar aquí y estamos seguros que la experiencia va a ser bien enriquecedora. Nuestra conferenciante principal en este simposio que da comienzo esta semana de actividades interesantes en la investigación clínica y translacional es la doctora Sarah Browner, y cuando yo ahora se las presente van a entender, espero yo, el por qué la invitamos y la importancia que tiene el trabajo que ella ha realizado con nuestra intención de llevar la investigación hacia la comunidad. La doctora Browner es catedrática auxiliar en la Escuela de Ciencias Vivas o Life Sciences en la Universidad de Arizona State en Tempe. Ella ostenta un grado doctoral en filosofía, lo que nosotros coloquialmente aquí en Puerto Rico hablamos de los PhD, ¿verdad? En biología, con una concentración en neuroinmunología, y también tiene una maestría en educación en la biología a nivel subgraduado, ambos grados de la Universidad de Stanford. Además de eso, tiene una maestría en biología integrativa y molecular en neurociencias del Instituto de Investigación Scripps, y tiene una experiencia postdoctoral buscando experiencias en la educación en biología subgraduada en la Universidad de Washington en Seattle. La doctora Browner está muy interesada en mejorar la experiencia de la educación a nivel subgraduado y cómo se evalúan los programas a esos niveles y aquellos asuntos que están relacionados a la equidad y el acceso de mujeres, grupos religiosos, LGBTQIA, estudiantes y estudiantes de transferencia. Ha recibido numerosas regalías, lo que aquí coloquialmente hablamos como grants, ¿verdad?, para investigar estos focos de atención. Y más recientemente, en el 2017, recibió una regalía de la National Science Foundation para dirigir 2 programas. Uno, para establecer un currículo basado en evidencia para medicina evolucionaria, y otro para preparar un curso basado en una red para investigación a nivel subgraduado. Además, ella ha recibido varias regalías institucionales que le han permitido desarrollar programas de investigación a nivel subgraduado. La doctora Browner ha investigado extensamente sobre la efectividad y el impacto de tener a nivel subgraduado experiencias de investigación y cómo éstas mejoran el pensamiento científico, la capacidad del estudiantado para poder analizar datos. Tiene muchas publicaciones en revistas muy prestigiosas y además es miembro en varios comités a nivel interinstitucionales en donde se discute estos asuntos relacionados a la educación en ciencia. Así que por todo lo anterior, nosotros creímos muy pertinente traer a la doctora Browner para que iniciara los trabajos de este simposio. Sara.
Thank you for that introduction. I took Spanish in school. I really wish I had paid more attention. I would have understood a lot more this morning. So I'm delighted to be here today. I tend to sometimes talk a little fast, so I'm going to try to slow down a little bit. And I think it's kind of ironic that I'm going to be talking to you about communicating science to non-scientists when I struggle so much at communicating in Spanish. So I think that that's kind of funny. Go ahead, next slide. So the outline for what I'd like to talk about today is the following. So first, I'm going to talk about a specific example of communicating science that I've actually experienced recently. So I started my academic journey as a neuroscientist, and now I do education research. And one of my recent education papers got picked up by some press, and so I want to talk a little bit about that as an explicit example of thinking about communicating science. Then I want to talk about best practices for how to communicate science to non-scientists, leading to a call for us to think about integrating science communication into our undergraduate and graduate curricula. And then I'm going to give you a specific example of a course that I've developed teaching undergraduates and graduate students science communication and some of the impact of that on students. So next slide. Next slide. Okay, so about a little over a month ago, I published this paper, Who Perceives They Are Smarter? Exploring the Influence of Student Characteristics on Student Academic Self-Concept and Physiology. And it ended up generating a lot of press. And so I ended up talking to a lot of newspapers and radio shows about this study. And so I thought it'd be an interesting way to start off this talk by presenting the study to you and thinking about how you might actually communicate it, because I was faced with having to figure out how to communicate it to journalists as I went along. So as I present the study, try to keep in your back of your mind how you would try to present it to a non-scientist or to a lay person. Next slide. So what is academic self-concept? So academic self-concept is a technical term for one's perception of his or her own ability in a specific domain. So you can have an academic self-concept in physiology and ecology and neuroscience, etc. Next slide. And it's really developed by one's experiences within a learning environment, including interactions with peers and instructors. Next. It's strongly influenced by one's perceptions of the academic abilities of other students. So the difference between this and your confidence in how much you know or your confidence in your intelligence is you're really comparing yourself to someone else when you're developing your academic self-concept. So how do you actually measure it? So you can measure it by basically comparing someone's perception of his or her academic ability as it compares with the academic abilities of a group of peers in that domain. Next. So historically, this has been studied in classrooms by asking an individual student how they compare themselves to everyone else in the class. And so they'll ask questions about what percentage of the class do you think you're smarter than, or that you have a higher academic self-concept. Next. But increasingly, across the world, and specifically in the United States, college biology classrooms and college science classrooms are being transitioned to active learning classrooms, where students are asked to work together more. So right now, I'm standing at the front of the room talking at you, and it's more of a traditional lecture. But more and more, we realize that students learn more when they turn to each other, talk to each other, and actually build their own knowledge and build their own understanding. And so studies have shown that these types of courses end up increasing students' understanding as well as decreasing their failure rates in courses. And so many more courses are being taught this way. However, when you start to do that, you're also asking students to look at the person next to them and to start comparing themselves a lot more to the person next to them. And so in addition to having students compare themselves to the class as a whole, we may actually begin having students compare themselves a lot more to the person sitting next to them. Next. So in addition to comparing students to the whole class, we can start to ask students, when you're working in these small groups, how do you feel, how does your intelligence compare to other people in the group? Next. So in this particular study, we decided to explore academic self-concept in two ways. We asked them to compare their perception of their intelligence compared to the class as a whole and compared to the person they work most closely with in the class. Next. So our research question was, to what extent do student characteristics predict student academic self-concept and physiology relative to the whole class? Next. To measure this, we basically asked students to what extent they thought that they were smarter than the whole class. And we looked at a lot of different variables of who students are and whether that might impact their answers on this. So we looked at gender, race, ethnicity, transfer status. So this, I mean, we have many of our students start off at community colleges or junior colleges, and then they transfer into the university. And so these students don't start off at that four-year institution, and so there's been studies that show that they often are disadvantaged, so we're looking at transfer students. Native language, whether or not they speak English in their home growing up. Anxiety, whether they self-report having feelings of anxiety. And then we also controlled for a student's prior GPA or grade point average. So this is the sum of all their grades in their prior courses. So it's a good way to kind of get a sense for students' academic ability. So what I'd like you to do right now, because studies have shown that if I talk at you, you're not going to take much away from this talk, I want you to turn to the person next to you and predict out of all of these factors, what do you think might impact students' academic self-concept in thinking about comparing the whole class? So it should get real loud in here as you turn to your neighbor. So real loud. I'm going to ask you to chat. So just like about 30 seconds, brainstorm which of these do you think might actually influence it. Okay, you have predictions in your minds. Okay, so I'm going to actually show what we ended up finding. You can compare it to what you were thinking about. So next. So we found that gender influences this, and so some of you may have predicted this if you're aware of some of the research that's been done thinking about how gender can influence students' experiences in science classrooms. And so what we ended up finding next is that if you take two students and you basically make those students the same in every other way, an average male student with a 3.3 GPA, so that's their kind of measure of academic ability, they're predicted to perceive that he's smarter than 66% of students in that physiology course. And next. However, an average female with that same GPA, so they should be basically the same level of smart, is predicted to perceive that she's only smarter than 54% of students in the physiology class. So we have this difference based on gender, and all other things between these two students are really equivalent, so it's only based on gender. So this is potentially a problem. Next. We also found that native language seems to have an impact. So next. So an average native English speaker is predicted to perceive that they're smarter than 61% of students in the physiology course. Next. But the average non-native English speaker is predicted to perceive that they're only smarter than 46% of the students in the class. And again, this is controlling for all other aspects of these students. So these students should be equivalent, but based on the language that's spoken at home, a non-native English speaker is predicted to perceive that they're smarter than only 46% compared to a native English speaker is 61%. So this could be problematic, right? Because we can think about if a student thinks that they're, smarter than other students in the class, that could influence how confident they are, that can influence the extent to which they're willing to share out their ideas in class, that can influence the extent to which they decide to go on in that particular science domain. So this is potentially a problem. But these classes are asking students to work together. So next slide. So we also wanted to ask, what are students' academic self-concept compared to people in their group, those people that they started chatting next to? So next. So again, we did a similar analysis, but this time we asked compared to the person that you worked most closely with. So when I just asked you to turn to your neighbor, you turn to kind of one or two people. So in class, we're asking students to do this every single day. So we basically asked them, who's that person that you work most closely with in class? Who do you typically talk to? Do you think that you're smarter than or less smart than that person? Again, we looked at these different variables. And again, I want you to turn to your neighbor, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and brainstorm which of these do you think is actually going to influence that when you're talking to the person next to you. So it should get real loud in here as I ask you to do this. Okay, folks have predictions? Okay, so what do we actually find? So next slide. Okay, so yet again we saw a gender difference in this particular question. So next, we found that the average male has a 61% chance of perceiving that he's smarter than his group mate. Next.
Sarah,
whereas the average...
Sorry. Excuse me, Sarah, could you speak slower, please? You're going at 100 miles per hour.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, So the average male has a 61% chance of perceiving that he's smarter than his group mate, but the average female has only a 33% chance of perceiving that she's smarter than her group mate. So these are two students, and again, we controlled for all aspects of that student. So they're equivalent except for gender. And we have this big difference in their perception of who's smart. Okay? So next. So in our kind of conclusions from this, and again, I want to just give you this as a kind of brief snapshot, we found that males and native English speakers have higher academic self-concept with regard to the whole class compared to females and non-native English speakers. So next. And when we asked about the person they work with in their groups, they have a higher males have a higher academic self-concept than females. We didn't see a difference based on native and non-native English speakers there. Okay. So we published this study, and then people got excited about it, and they started asking us a lot of questions about it. So what I would like you to do now is turn to your neighbor and think about how you might communicate this study to a non-scientist journalist. So what would you emphasize? What are you thinking might actually be difficult to convey? And what might be easier ways of getting it across to people? So go ahead and turn to the person next to you and try to communicate it. And I know that you've just gotten the kind of the snapshot of it. So it should get real loud in here as you turn to your neighbor. Okay, maybe about 30 more seconds to finish up your ideas. So can I hear out from some folks? What are people's ideas? How would you try to communicate this? What would you emphasize? What might be difficult? Can I get brave volunteers?
Microphone here. Volunteers.
So in communicating this to a non-scientist, there's a question among us here that says, first of all, will people understand how does a study that is done in the context of a theology course has relatedness to the overall education atmosphere?
Yeah, so great question. So I did this study in a physiology course. Does it relate more broadly? Does it relate to all of biology? Could it relate to an ecology course? Could it relate to a pharmacy course, right? Could it, so that's a really good point. So I'm gonna get a couple ideas from folks and then kind of talk about how I thought about doing this. Other ideas?
Sorry, my concern would be how to interpret it, because I don't have a gold standard. So I don't know if men are overestimating their intelligence or women are underestimating their capabilities.
Yeah,
so it's how to interpret it. What does it mean? That would be my concern.
Yeah, so we see these differences based on gender, and we see these differences based on whether someone speaks English at home or not, right? But how do we actually interpret it? Is it a problem that one gender is overestimating, right? Of part of this that I didn't explain is that the average grade in the course was about a 3.3 GPA. So if you figure, if we look at those kind of average students, they probably should think they're about 50% smarter than the class. So women may be more accurate at estimating that, and men may be overestimating it. But you bring up a really good point. Does that actually, is that bad that the men are overestimating it? Or are they actually getting benefits by overestimating their intelligence in that class that women also could get if they also overestimated? So that's a really good point. Other ideas? Maybe one more idea? Yeah.
One of my concerns or worries is if someone asks me how to talk about this is what I'm going to emphasize. Is men going to be more self-confidence, or women are lower, or woman needs to improve? Because the message we will be saying will be captured by the press or the interviewer, and it could be misunderstood.
Absolutely. So what's the message that you want someone to walk away from this with, right? So all of these are really, really good points. There's a lot unpacked in here, and I obviously didn't explain the entire study to you in this short period of time, right? But you have to make decisions. What is too much detail? What is not enough detail, right? If you don't give people enough detail, then they may misinterpret things or they may overgeneralize, right? But if you give too much detail, then they're just going to lose the main point. Something that's particularly important if ever you're talking to journalists is that their attention spans are often really short, and they want often a one-sentence kind of take-home from your study, and that's often very hard to actually do, right, without overgeneralizing. So that's really important. The question of, we did this in the context of a physiology course. Can you extrapolate this to other biology courses? Can you extrapolate this to other science courses? The answer is maybe. We didn't do that. That's not what our data said, right? We could predict, based on what we know about a physiology course that's a type of biology course, that we'd probably see similar patterns, but we can't actually say for sure, right? So, and then you have to think about, okay, so we actually had two findings in there. One was a gender finding, that males are thinking that they're smarter than a higher percentage of the class, and that they're more likely to think that they're smarter than their group mate. And then we also saw that native and non-native English speaker difference, right? Which of those do you emphasize? Do you emphasize both? Okay, so I want to kind of explain how I went about doing it. It wasn't completely the right way. I made a lot of mistakes en route. But next slide. So I'm not quite sure why. I've published a lot of papers at this point, and no other paper has ever gotten as much press as this paper. And I think that it's that one reporter from NBC News has a daughter who's interested in science, and she came across our university's press release for this, and she got excited about it. And so she wrote one of the first articles, and it just took off. And it's gotten tweeted out over 4,000 times on Twitter, and then once that first article kind of hit the ground, then so many more articles came up, right? So this is a list of some of the articles as well as the titles, and so you can actually pick up some of the things that we already talked about, right? So men really do think they're more intelligent than peers. Men perceive themselves as smarter even compared to women whose grades are just as good. Men more likely to think they're smart, women downplay intelligence. So the titles are interpreting this study, right? And in many ways, we had no control over the title and what they decided to take away from the study. Some of these people we actually talked to. Many of them we didn't actually talk to. Many of them wrote articles based on other articles. And so you have that problem where things get misinterpreted as you kind of go along. We ended up having it published in a bunch of other languages, and so I have no idea what those titles actually say, right? Next slide. And then we ended up actually getting it also in the New York Times. Yeah. Yeah, go back. So you guys can tell me whether or not that's accurate. So the problem with that, so to kind of repeat that out so everyone here, if it says that men think they're smarter than their women companions and that women acknowledge that it's true, we didn't measure either of those things. So we didn't measure that men think they're smarter than women. We measured that men think they're smarter than the class as a whole, right? We never actually asked, comparing yourselves to another man or a woman, do you think you're smarter? And we never asked women about whether they think that men are actually smarter, right? So you can begin to see how it's exciting that it gets picked up, but then it starts to, the story starts to kind of change, and then someone picks it up, reads it, and they might interpret something very different than the original study. And so it really matters how careful our language is. We've actually been contacted by someone because of the amount of press that's been picked up on this, and because of the different stories that actually are different than what we published. We've actually been contacted by a science journalist that wants to write a story about how communication of science is difficult and how often people can misinterpret things. Yeah.
Sarah, if it is possible, can you comment on the Mother Jones article? I think it was on the previous slide.
Yeah, previous slide.
Mother Jones.
Maybe previous slide. I don't see it. Next, previous slide.
Oh, there is.
We did not measure whether men were arrogant bastards at all, right? But, so.
What about the idea of a general? Okay. What about the idea? Mother Jones is promoting feminism, making distinctions or the importance of being aware of social class difference, racial differences. And I just wonder if you want to make some comment regarding that particular title.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk to them. We weren't interviewed by them. They picked up other studies. And that certainly would not be our conclusion, right? Nothing in what we did showed that men were being jerks to women, right? And in fact, it goes back to the question, men thought that they were smarter than a higher percentage of the class. That might actually be a really good thing. And so the fact that there's a gender difference, in my opinion, is a problem, right? But maybe it's not that we need to diminish men's intelligence, but actually maybe we need to increase women's intelligence, because having a slightly inflated perception of your intelligence could actually be a really good thing, right? So, but I don't know, right? That's a speculation. So, you know, if we go back to the study and think about what we want to do, we probably want to try to decrease men's confidence a little bit and increase women's confidence a little bit to try to meet in the middle. My problem with it is that there's a gender difference, not that, but it's certainly not males' fault that they're higher. And these titles, as you can see, are very inflammatory, right? And that causes people to click on them, right? And that causes people to read them and get excited about it. And if you look at, you know, I probably shouldn't have, but I've looked at a lot of the comments under some of the news stories, and then you get polar opposite comments, right? You get a bunch of comments that are, men are terrible, men, you know, take over the world, men, you know, contribute too much, et cetera, and then you've got it from the other side that are like, well, we need to have gender balance, et cetera, right? And so this reinforces this idea that our science and how we present our science becomes really important, right? I've ended up doing some interviews, both on TV and radio, from this study, and that has been fascinating because as far as figuring out what to emphasize, the radio hosts often choose what questions to ask, and depending on what questions they ask, they can actually spin the story in a totally different way, and at multiple times, I've had to correct them and bring it back and really say, this is one study, this is one class, we can't really overgeneralize, right? It's an interesting first step, but we need to do a lot more studies. And something, if you go forward a couple slides to the New York Times, yeah. Something I really liked about this study is that I was really clear with the reporter that I talked to for the New York Times, and he was a really good reporter and really wanted to know exactly what we could say and what we couldn't say from the study. And I made it really clear that it was just one study done in one class, right, and that we would need to repeat it. And he ended the article with my comment about how it's just one study. And I really appreciated that, because I think too often we take a single study and we just run with it. And then the lay people, or people who are not scientists, just end up getting almost whiplash, where they don't realize, why are we supposed to do one thing one week and another thing the next week, and they don't understand how science is tentative and how we have to build on our findings and how we have to replicate our findings. And so I thought that that was a really positive piece from this New York Times article. But it became very clear to me that it takes two people. It takes the person communicating the research, and it also takes the journalist to ask the right questions and to think about it. And both parties have to try to work together to convey science in a way that's going to be as accurate as possible, right? And you see there's many examples with this that it conveyed it in a way that was not actually accurate. Yeah. Yeah, so why is it important? That's a great transition. So next slide. So next slide. So some articles I would say were more accurate. So who's smarter in the classroom, men or women? New studies shows it's about perception. So that would be an accurate kind of take home from the study. But some of these titles, women still crippled by self-doubt even when they're as smart as men. We didn't measure self-doubt at all, right? And so these titles will cause people to click on them, but they're not necessarily accurate. Next slide. So going back to thinking about how you were trying to kind of communicate the study to your neighbor, you might think, did you run into similar problems? Were there ways that it was difficult for you to try to explain the results in a way that didn't overgeneralize? Something in particular that was hard about the study is we ran regressions for the study, so everything was a prediction. So it's that males were more likely to think that they're smart, right? And so what journalists often wanted to do is they wanted to say, well, males are smarter, or males think they're smarter. And it's like, well, these are actually, we're looking more at probabilities and odds ratios. And so this became something that was hard when we wanted to be as scientifically accurate as possible. We ran into a wall when we were trying to talk to the journalists. So next slide. So I learned a lot from this process, mainly that I need to get better at communicating. I think a lot about communicating science. I've taught how to communicate science, but even doing this process, I realized that there's much that I still need to learn, and I still need to get better. And for sure, the first interview I did, I made a lot of mistakes that then in subsequent interviews, I got better at. So why does it matter, right? And so I think that it matters because it's something that we need to start thinking about more explicitly. And I think often scientists assume that we spend a lot of time in training learning how to do good science, and then that dissemination of the science, or just talking about our science to other people, is something that we just add on, and it's easy to do, right? But I think the reality is it's actually very difficult to do. And more, I think we have examples of when we don't do a good job at this, or if we don't take the time to communicate our science, we end up with this divide where there's the scientists that think about their science and care about issues related to science, and then you have a whole group of people that don't care about science, that don't necessarily believe science, that don't trust scientists. And as we see that divide increase, particularly in the United States right now, we need to find ways of going back and bridging that gap. And so I'd like to kind of continue to segue through my talk and think about best practices for communicating science to non-scientists, and then explicitly think about how we can actually build that into the curriculum. So next slide. So I think you got to convince your audience to care. So my audience cared because it was a flashy kind of topic based on gender, but often I had to convince my audience what aspects of the study to actually care about, right? They wanted to pit it as a battle against between the genders, and so I really had to convince them why it mattered in terms of education, and why it mattered in terms of women's persistence in science, and why it mattered in terms of a really strong letter of recommendation that an instructor might write. That all might be dictated based on someone's confidence in their own intelligence compared to other people. You need to convey your key points in a way that's accurate but accessible, so try to identify your main points beforehand. So I think a good thing that I started doing was actually writing down my main points and writing them down in a way that was as concise as possible, but conveyed those main points. Something that happened with most of the news stories is the story about native language disappeared. So it became a story about gender in the news. And I think one or two of the news stories also reported the finding about native English speakers versus non-native English speakers, which is really interesting. And it's particularly interesting as more and more students are first-generation students who are coming into college, who have families who speak other languages and not English, and how that influences their experience in the classroom. But that got lost from the study because it ended up being kind of more flashy to have that gender story. And so that was a decision that we made when we started kind of pitching it to people. But that's something that looking back on it, maybe we shouldn't have made that decision. But then I'm not sure that the news people would still pick that up. Identify your audience. Really think about who that audience is. What's their background? You don't want to oversimplify things, but you also don't want to use language that they don't understand. Try to get them to relate to it somehow. You want to try to limit jargon and technical language while still remaining scientifically accurate. So you want to think about words that you're using every day. They're mostly jargon, right? And so things that you think that everyone knows, someone else might not know. And so really helping to kind of break it down in a way that's easy for them to understand is important while still remaining scientifically accurate. And that's a challenge because a lot of what we do, the specific language and the nuances of the language matter. And so you have to figure out kind of what are you willing to give up in telling your story that still allows you to be scientifically accurate. And you want to be concise. So the first couple interviews that I did with radio shows, they cut me off because I just was going off and talking way too much. And they wanted me to do short, kind of 30-second segments. And so I had to relearn kind of my story and that I had to be much more concise. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So the question or the comment is about statistics and how the average layperson doesn't understand statistics, right? And even many scientists don't really understand statistics, right? And trying to explain to people about a statistical finding is really difficult because the language that you need to use to stay accurate is not the language that reporters and journalists want to use, right? And so that I found very, very challenging when I was doing that story. And I think kind of finally you want to be excited and explicit about what are the most interesting aspects of the science, but you don't want to overgeneralize, right? If you found that one thing works in one classroom, you don't want to say that everyone should do that in every classroom, et cetera, et cetera. So next slide. So why does this matter? So we think that communicating to non-scientists it's difficult. So part of the problem lies upstream of that interaction between scientists and members of the media, and it exists because we underestimate how difficult it is for scientists to communicate effectively with a diversity of audiences, and most scientists don't receive formal training in science communication. And I think that first piece is something that we can't really, it's going to remain difficult, but we can start doing things about that formal training. So next slide. Next. So basically, I want to present a call to actually integrate formal training in science communication in the undergraduate and graduate curricula. So science communication, we all think that it's important in principle. It's been outlined in kind of national documents as something that's really important for biology majors to know, but very few people actually study this. Can you go back previously? And so if you actually integrate it, you can promote the skills and confidence to effectively communicate. So next. So how could you actually build out programs? So I think teaching science communication in the context of an actual science discipline is really helpful and useful for students, because if you teach it as this separate thing that's not related to their coursework, then they may think it's this fluffy thing that doesn't actually matter. And instead, if you integrate it into the actual science curriculum and the actual science coursework, that can be a really positive thing. You want to give students lots of opportunities to practice. You want to encourage them to basically have real-world application. So in some versions of these types of courses, you might actually have them produce things that non-scientists could actually use. You might bring in non-scientists in the classroom to have students communicate. And you want to think about both written and oral communication, because both are going to be mattering. So just go forward. Yep, next slide. Okay, so I want to give an explicit example of how I did this in the context of a neuroimmunology course. So next slide. So this was kind of a standard undergraduate, graduate neuroimmunology course where we learned about a lot of neurological diseases that have some immune component to them. We talked about multiple sclerosis, we talked about stroke. And so it was set up like a typical class where someone would come in and give a lecture on an area of neuroimmunology, but then we added on the science communication component. And so every week they would go to the lecture by the person, then they would read a scientific paper based on that topic, and then they would try to take that primary scientific paper and communicate it to a non-scientist, writing up a two-page kind of New York Times style article. So trying to write in a way that was jargon-free, trying to write in a way that was going to be applicable to someone who had very little scientific background. Students wrote 5 articles over the course of the semester or the term, and then importantly, they had opportunities to revise them. So they could write it, they'd get feedback, then they could revise it. It was a small class, so we were able to do this. So with a large class, you probably can't do this. But they could keep revising that article again and again so that everyone had the opportunity of getting the highest score possible. They just had to keep putting in the work. And we thought that this opportunity to revise it and actually incorporate feedback became important. So next slide. So this is kind of an outline of what happened in the course. So we had background lectures, then the students read primary scientific papers, they wrote these New York Times style summaries of the papers, then we had small discussion sections where we talked about the ideas in the primary scientific paper, we talked about how to actually communicate that, and then they were given that opportunity to revise based on feedback from TAs or teaching assistants. So these are graduate teaching assistants who are teaching the undergraduates in this course. Next slide. So we asked 3 questions from an education perspective. So we asked, what is the impact of this course on students' perception of their ability to read primary scientific papers? What's the impact of the course on their confidence and their ability to communicate to other scientists? And what's their confidence in their ability to communicate to a layperson audience? And so I'm going to focus mostly on the last 2 because those were more related to science communication. So next. Okay, so what did our data actually look like? So this was a small pilot study. It was a small class, so you'll see the sample size is 15 students, so that's very small, even for education and research. But those are how many students were in our class, right? And so this is something where this is some indication that it had a positive impact, but it's one study, and other folks need to repeat this study. So we asked them, do you think your ability to understand primary scientific papers has improved? All the students thought it had. Do you think your ability to communicate science to lay people through writing has improved as a result of the course? Most of the students thought that that was the case. Next. We asked if they thought their ability to communicate science verbally to other scientists improved, and again, most of the students thought that. And then we asked them specifically about their ability to communicate through writing. And more students disagreed with this comment. because probably writing is hard, right? And so even though they had practice, as they continued to do it in the course, there were still some students that still very much struggled. And it's often one of these things where sometimes you don't realize your deficiencies in something until you start doing it, until you start practicing, right? Next slide. We also asked students their confidence in certain things. So we asked them about their confidence in their ability to verbally communicate to lay people about the scientific information that they learned in class, and we found gains from pre-course to post-course. So we measured students' confidence at the very beginning of the course, first day, and the very end of the course. We also asked them about their confidence in writing New York Times style articles directed to a layperson audience, and again, we saw a significant gain. Next. We asked them about their confidence in talking to peers who are science majors about scientific information they learned in class. We again saw a gain in their ability to write a review-style article directed to a scientific audience on scientific information I learned in class. We saw a gain. And then explaining scientific information I learned in class to graduate student teaching assistants, we also saw a gain there. And then finally, explaining scientific information that they learned in class to science professors, we saw a gain. So this was important to us because these students seemed like they increased in their confidence in talking to professors, in talking to graduate student teaching assistants, as well as their peers. So this ability of being able to communicate, it seemed like it wasn't just limited to lay people in this course, it was also to other scientists. Next slide. We also asked them at the very end of the course, I think this course improved my ability to write a New York Times style article, and this was at a score of from 1 to 5, so 4.9 is very high on that scale, so that makes sense because they wrote a lot of those. Ability to write a review style article directed to other scientists, that was a little lower. We asked them to write a review article about a topic of their choice. Ability to communicate science verbally, so again, fairly high. Ability to comprehend primary scientific papers, explain scientific information I learned in class to graduate student teaching assistants, and then we asked them about their overall understanding of neuroimmunology, because this was a neuroimmunology course. The point of them taking the course was actually to learn neuroimmunology. All the other science communication was all kind of the extra stuff. And so it was exciting that they walked out of this course thinking that their understanding of neuroimmunology was pretty high. So we're thinking by embedding it into this course, they're able to learn both the science as well as being much better at communicating science both to scientists as well as lay people. Next slide. So we asked them why they perceive their ability to communicate science through writing has actually improved. Next slide. And we asked this an open-ended question, and we went through and coded students' open-ended answers to see what they came up with. And they mentioned things that aren't that surprising, that they were better at identifying the main points of scientific papers because they had been reading so many papers and communicating about those papers. They felt they were better at understanding scientific papers. They felt that they had practice with writing, and they had gotten feedback on writing, so that feedback seemed to be pretty important. And then there were a few other reasons. So next slide. We also asked them what factors actually influence their ability to communicate science verbally to other scientists. Next slide. And again, going through the same methodology, they came up with that they're better at identifying main points. They have a deeper understanding of neuroimmunology. So this was something that we thought was really interesting, that to be able to effectively communicate to someone, you really need to be an expert on what you're communicating about. And that it seemed like when they felt that they knew more about immunology, they were actually better able to communicate it. And then they highlighted practice writing those New York Times style summaries and discussing those primary papers in class. Next slide. And then we asked students about their perceptions about their attitudes about communicating to lay people. And overall, students still felt like it was a really difficult task. So they didn't leave the course thinking that, oh, this is something that's really easy, this is something that I can absolutely do. They had kind of mixed opinions about whether or not they thought that they could actually do it, but they all left thinking that it was really important to do. Next slide. So kind of in thinking back to our recommendations for teaching science communication to scientists, I think we want to teach it in the context of basic science, and we did this in this course by embedding it in a neuroimmunology course. That practice doesn't make perfect, but it does increase skills. So we gave students multiple opportunities to talk to other scientists, to talk to their peers, to write about science, and that seemed to be good. that encourage real-world application of coursework to improve student motivation. So what they were doing seemed to actually matter. We told the students that these New York Times style summaries that they were going to write, we were going to try to actually publish them and have lay people read them. We didn't end up doing that because it ended up being too hard to basically do that, but that seemed to help student motivation in caring about what they were doing. And then we tried to implement both written and oral communication as two important components of the course to get students to learn how to communicate in both ways, because both are equally important and are difficult in their own ways. So next slide. So I want to acknowledge the folks that were involved in developing that course, Larry Steinman and Jordan Price, so both are neuroscientists who helped teach this course. And then as a last slide, I want you to think about your own research and kind of put it in the context of this talk and thinking about kind of communicating it. How would you actually take your own research or a recent paper you've read or something you've recently learned about in class if you're a student, and how would you try to communicate that? And so I want you to take about 30 seconds to think about it, and then I want you to turn to your neighbor and try to communicate that using some of these strategies that we've talked about. So go ahead and turn to your neighbor and try to communicate something, your own research, something you've read recently, something you've learned about, trying to use some of these strategies. Okay, about 30 seconds to finish up your thoughts. Okay, so let's come back together. So in the ideal world, we could take a couple hours to hear out from each of you to kind of see how you're communicating, to give feedback, to give pointers. The best advice I could have going forth, if you want to try to improve your ability to communicate your science, is to try to do it often and frequently and get feedback from people. Ask people what they actually understand after you actually communicate it to them to see if your main points have actually gotten across, because often their take-home will be very different than what your take-home would be. So next slide. So with that, these are two of the papers that have kind of guided some of my thinking about science communication and integrating it into the curricula. And with that, I will take questions, and I believe we have the panel discussion.
Voy a hacer la pregunta en español. Spanish, just for the benefit.
Okay.
And to use this. Solo por curiosidad. En la presentación, en la. You have it?
Yes.
En la diapositiva que usted presentó sobre el estudio que hicieron con 14 estudiantes, creo que son 4 diapositivas antes. ¿Podrían volver atrás 4?
Sure. Can we go back to, can we go back a couple slides?
Ahora
Previous
sí.
Slides. I don't know.
¿Podría?
Could we go back a couple slides, please? Yep, keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. I think back to the data.
Yes.
Keep going. Keep going. This, keep going.
Sorry, it's a little. Okay, there. Not,
Okay, forward. Yeah,
La
keep
pr-
going. Keep
adelántala.
going. Okay, keep
Esa.
going like 3 more.
Las
So,
4. Esa.
yeah.
Solo por curiosidad, esas personas que dijeron que no estaban de acuerdo con la percepción y recordando el estudio que presentaron antes, ¿podrían ser mujeres?
That's super interesting. So I did this study like 6 years ago. So I wasn't thinking about it at the time. But I think that that's really interesting. And I could go back and actually look at the data to see who were males and females. But that would be really interesting. We don't need any criticisms.
Antes de pasar al panel de reactores de la conferencia, solicitó la presencia del doctor Rubén García García y del doctor José Moscoso Álvarez para entregar un reconocimiento de agradecimiento a la doctora Sarah Brownell.
Doctora Brunel, a nombre del proyecto de título 5 colaborativo entre el Recinto de Ciencias Médicas y la Universidad Central del Caribe, quisiera presentarle con este agradecimiento por su participación. Want to hand you an acknowledgement for your participation.
Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And this is Puerto Rican very important festivity, Los Tres Reyes Magos, for you from Puerto Rico.
Thank you.
Thank you.